The nature of mind. Why thoughts never stop. Buddhist wisdom. There is something about the human mind that we live with every day, and yet rarely stop to look at directly. It does not stop. From the moment we wake until the moment we finally fall asleep, something inside us is thinking, planning, remembering, judging, worrying. The body can rest. The eyes can close. The world outside can grow completely silent. And still the voice inside continues, almost without pause, for the entire length of a human life. If you sit quietly for even a minute and watch, you can see this for yourself. A thought arises, then another, about what you need to do tomorrow, about something someone said last week, about the very act of sitting and watching. There is no off switch. There is no quiet room inside the head where the noise can be left at the door. And for many people, this inner voice is not just constant. It is quietly exhausting. The background hum of a life that rarely feels fully at peace. So a question rises, sooner or later, in almost every thoughtful person. What is this thing? Where do these endless thoughts come from? Why will the mind not be quiet, even when we beg it to? These are the questions the Buddha looked at carefully and patiently. What he discovered was an invitation more than a doctrine, a way of looking at your own mind that asks no belief from you, only the willingness to look. Let us begin with what he saw. The Buddha's first observation was strikingly precise. Thoughts do not appear from nowhere. They arise from a chain of conditions, and once that chain is set in motion, the mind multiplies them faster than we can possibly notice. He gave this multiplication a name, papañca. The word is sometimes translated as mental proliferation, but the clearest way to describe it is this: the mind's tendency to take a small seed and grow an entire forest from it. A detailed map of how this happens comes through Venerable Mahakaccana, one of the Buddha's principal disciples, renowned for his gift of drawing out the full meaning of the Buddha's compact sayings. The chain he described, and which the Buddha later confirmed in every detail, runs like this. Dependent on the eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. The meeting of these three, sense organ, sense object, and consciousness, is what is called contact. With contact as a requisite condition, there is feeling. What one feels, one perceives. What one perceives, one thinks about. What one thinks about, one proliferates. And once proliferation has begun, the perceptions and categories of papañca assail that person. With regard to past forms, present forms, future forms, and on through every door of the senses, every door of the mind. From a single moment of meeting between consciousness and the world, the mind spreads outward into a vast tangle of stories, assumptions, memories, predictions, judgments, until a whole imagined world has been built around what was, at first, a very small moment. This is papañca, and for the modern mind, flooded with messages, images, and half-conversations every single day, papañca is no longer occasional. It has become the background noise of life. We live inside a continuous storm of our own making. We are rarely in the moment itself. We are almost always in the story the mind has built about the moment. So this is the first answer to why the mind never stops. Each contact gives rise to a feeling. Each feeling gives rise to a perception. Each perception gives rise to a thought. And each thought, almost instantly, gives rise to 10 more. The chain runs by itself, faster than we can interrupt it. But the question lying beneath this is even deeper. Why is this chain always in motion? Why does the ordinary mind almost never experience true peace, while the mind of an awakened being moves through the world with a lightness we can barely imagine? For that, we have to look further down, to the very roots of human suffering itself. Beneath every individual thought, beneath even the chain of papañca, the Buddha pointed to two forces that drive the entire stream of consciousness forward. These are the deep roots, and as long as they are alive in us, the mind will never truly settle. The first is avijja, ignorance. Not stupidity, not lack of education, but a much subtler thing, the inability to perceive reality as it actually is. We see the world through a clouded lens, and we mistake our seeing for the truth. The second is tanha, craving. The constant inner pull that wants to hold on to what feels good, push away what feels bad, and become someone other than who we are right now. Even when nothing is happening, craving is active, wanting the present moment to be slightly different than it is. These two work together, and they never rest. Because we do not see things clearly, we crave. Because we crave, we cannot see things clearly. The clouded lens and the closed hand reinforce each other in a loop that has been turning for as long as we have been alive. And here is something worth noticing. The Buddha taught that ignorance is the deepest root, and that from ignorance, through a long chain of intermediate conditions, the mind eventually reaches out to meet the world. At the point of that reaching, contact occurs between the senses and what they meet. Out of contact, feeling is born. And out of feeling, craving stirs and takes hold. From contact and feeling onward, the surface chain we have already traced takes over. Feeling becomes perception. Perception becomes thinking. Thinking becomes proliferation. So the storm of papañca rolling through our minds every day is not arising from nowhere. It is the surface portion of a deeper chain, the part we can see. The links beneath it, ignorance, and the long sequence of conditions it sets in motion, are the part we cannot see, the underwater foundation that keeps the surface activity flowing without rest. This is why papañca cannot be stopped by simply trying to stop thinking. The thinking is the symptom. The symptom keeps appearing because its causes, ignorance and craving, keep producing it, link by link, beneath the threshold of awareness. And here is where this teaching becomes practical. If thoughts arise from conditions, then there is no fixed thinker sitting somewhere inside, choosing each thought as it arises. There are only conditions meeting conditions, giving rise to one thought after another, like waves rising and falling on the surface of a sea that has its own movement. This is why we cannot stop the mind by command. There is no one to give the command to. The worry is not arising because some inner self chose worry. It is arising because the conditions for worry are present. A memory, a feeling, a sleepless night, a wound that has not healed. The thought is a result, not a decision. And this is exactly why the Buddha's path makes sense. If thoughts arose from a self, we would have to defeat that self. We would have to win an inner battle, and no one has ever won that battle. But thoughts arise from conditions, and conditions can be understood. Conditions can be tended. Conditions can, slowly and patiently, be brought to an end. You do not need to silence a thinker who does not exist. You only need to gently address the conditions out of which the thoughts keep being born. This is a real shift in how we approach the problem. It moves the entire problem from a battlefield to a garden. We are no longer trying to conquer something. We are learning to recognize what is feeding the restlessness and to stop feeding it. And once you begin to see this, something shifts. you stop being ashamed of your own mind. The thoughts that arise, angry, jealous, sad, fearful, arise because the conditions for them are present, not because of who you are at the core. A thought is a weather pattern, not a verdict on who you are. You are not the one producing the thoughts. You are the one in whom thoughts are arising. Now that we understand why thoughts arise so endlessly, we can look more closely at what this mind actually is. And here we encounter a paradox at the heart of Buddhist teaching. In the Asuttava Sutta, the Buddha gave a description of the mind worth examining carefully. He observed that an ordinary untaught person might at some point grow disenchanted with the body, might see clearly that this body composed of the four great elements grows and decays, is taken up and laid aside, and might therefore wish to be free of attachment to it. But that same person, he said, finds it almost impossible to do the same with what we call mind, mentality, and consciousness, because for a very long time it has been held to, embraced, and grasped as, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. And then the Buddha said something quite unexpected. It would actually be less misleading, he taught, for an ordinary person to take this physical body as the self than to take the mind as the self. Why? Because this body of four elements is seen standing for 1 year, 2 years, 10, 50, even 100 years. But that which is called mind, that which is called mentality, that which is called consciousness, by day and by night, it arises as one thing and ceases as another. It is just like a monkey roaming through a forest. It grabs hold of one branch, lets that go, and grabs another, lets that go, and grabs still another. The mind we have been calling me all our lives, the Buddha said, behaves in exactly that way, moment by moment, ceaselessly, without pause. The monkey mind. This is the Buddha's own image, in his own words. And yet there is more. The Buddha taught that beneath this surface of restless, jumping thought, the mind also stores something much quieter and much more troubling. He called these anusaya, latent tendencies, sleeping seeds, the quiet residues of every strong reaction we have ever had. Every time we react with craving, with aversion, with fear, a kind of seed is planted in the deeper layers of the mind, where ordinary awareness cannot reach. These seeds do not fade simply because time has passed. They lie asleep. They wait. When the right condition arrives, a song on the radio, a familiar smell, a quality of afternoon light that reminds you of a childhood summer, they wake up. Suddenly a thought, a feeling, an entire wave of emotion rises in you, and you do not understand where it came from. This is why a memory you thought you had made peace with can still bring tears 20 years later. An old seed, planted long ago, has been touched by a present condition and has risen to the surface. So the mind, as the Buddha described it, is restless on the surface and burdened underneath, a monkey above with sleeping seeds below. And yet, and here is the paradox, this is not the whole truth about the mind. In the Papañca Sutta, the Buddha said something that turns the entire picture around. He taught, this mind, monks, is luminous, and it is defiled by incoming defilements. Then he repeated himself with a single change. This mind, monks, is luminous, and it is freed from incoming defilements. Two short statements, almost identical, and yet between them lies the entire path of awakening. The Buddha then added something equally important. The ordinary, untrained person does not discern this luminosity, and therefore, he said, for such a person, there is no development of the mind. But the well-instructed disciple does discern it as it actually is, and therefore, for such a person, the mind can be developed. To even begin practicing, one must first glimpse this fact, that the agitation, the greed, the aversion, the confusion are not woven into the fabric of awareness itself. They are visitors. They come and they can go. This is the paradox at the heart of Buddhist understanding. The mind that runs like a monkey, that carries sleeping seeds of pain, that proliferates endlessly, that same mind is also, at its very root, luminous and free. The agitation is not the mind itself. It is something happening to the mind, like clouds passing across the sky. And the practice of awakening, in the end, is not the building of something new. It is the slow uncovering of what has been there all along, beneath the noise. If the restlessness is not who you are at your core, then liberation is not a matter of becoming a different person. It is a matter of letting the clouds thin out until the natural clarity beneath them shines through on its own. If the mind is naturally luminous but covered over by clouds of restlessness, then we have to ask a very practical question. What does it cost a human being to live inside a mind that is never observed, never quieted, never given any space at all? The Buddha addressed this directly. In the Vitakkasanthana Sutta, the discourse on the removal of distracting thoughts, he compared a mind caught in unwholesome thought to a person walking too quickly, who must learn to slow down, then stand still, then sit, and finally lie down, gradually moving from coarse activity into rest. Thought is not weightless. Every anxious loop, every resentful replay, every imagined catastrophe consumes real energy from the one organism we are given to live in. This is something modern psychology has only recently begun to confirm. People who ruminate heavily, who replay the past, rehearse imaginary conversations, anticipate worst-case futures, suffer measurable consequences in the body. After a day of just sitting and worrying, they are as tired as if they had carried stones across a field. The body does not distinguish between physical labor and the metabolic burden of constant inner storytelling. There is a second cost, and it is perhaps even greater. A mind lost in papañca is no longer in contact with reality. It is in contact with its own projections. It walks through a beautiful afternoon, but instead of feeling the afternoon, it is rehearsing tomorrow's meeting. It sits across from someone it loves, but instead of being present with them, it is turning over an old grievance. Life is happening, and we are not there for it. And there is a third cost, more subtle still. The longer we live inside our thinking without ever stepping back from it, the more we come to believe that we are our thoughts. Each anxious story feels like the truth. Each self-critical voice feels like an accurate description of who we are. The monologue becomes our identity by default. This is what the Buddha called identification with the aggregates, the quiet, lifelong mistake of taking the passing weather of the mind for the sky itself. So the cost of an unwatched mind is real, and it is large. It costs us our energy, our presence, and finally, our sense of who we actually are. And it raises, with real urgency, the question that everything in this conversation has been moving toward. If we cannot stop the mind, and if we can no longer afford to be swept away by it, then what are we actually supposed to do? The answer the Buddha gave is so simple that people often miss it. He did not teach us to stop thinking. He taught us to stop being carried away by our thinking. These are two completely different things, and confusing them has caused a great deal of unnecessary suffering among those who come to meditation, hoping for a silent mind. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the Buddha's instruction is plain and direct. The formula, repeated like a quiet refrain throughout the discourse, runs through every state of mind in turn. When the mind has lust, the meditator simply discerns. The mind has lust. When the mind is free from lust, he discerns. The mind is free from lust. When the mind has hatred, he discerns. The mind has hatred. When the mind is free from hatred, he discerns. The mind is free from hatred. When the mind is contracted, he discerns this. When it is scattered, he discerns this. When it is concentrated, he discerns this. When it is liberated, he discerns this. Notice what is happening here, and just as importantly, what is not happening. The meditator is not pushing the lust away, not arguing with the hatred, not trying to fix the scattered mind into a focused one through force. The whole instruction, the whole practice, rests in that one small verb. To discern, to know, to see what is there, clearly, without turning away, and without jumping in. The great Thai forest master Ajahn Chah expressed this in the plainest possible terms. He often said that the mind is like water. If you keep stirring it, it stays cloudy. If you leave it alone, the sediment settles of its own accord, and the water becomes clear without any effort from you. And he gave an image that students of his tradition still remember. Sit on the bank of the river and watch the water flow. Do not jump in. This is the whole art, quietly stated. Each thought that arises is a leaf floating past on the stream. You do not have to reach down and pick it up. You do not have to push it away. You only have to see it come and see it go. The thoughts lose their power to pull you under. You have not conquered them. The river cannot be conquered. You have only stopped feeding them, and that turns out to be enough. But here we must be careful, because a misunderstanding waits at this point. Some people hear this and conclude that all thinking is the enemy, that the goal is to become a silent, thoughtless being sitting motionless against a wall. This is not what the Buddha taught. In the Dvedhavitaka Sutta, the discourse on the 2 kinds of thought, the Buddha divided thoughts into 2 categories. He spoke of unwholesome thoughts, anxious rumination, resentment, compulsive desire, hatred, kinds of thinking to be recognized, watched, and released. But he also spoke of wholesome thoughts, thoughts of kindness, reflection on the Dhamma, careful problem-solving, generosity, letting go. These are to be actively cultivated, the way a gardener tends a promising seedling. And yet, in that same discourse, the Buddha added a reflection drawn from his own meditation before awakening. He recounted that as he meditated diligently before his awakening, a thought of renunciation arose in him, and he understood it clearly. This thought of renunciation has arisen. It does not lead to harming myself. It does not lead to harming others. It nourishes wisdom. It leads toward freedom from distress. It leads toward awakening. Even if I were to keep on thinking and pondering this all night, all day, even all night and all day together, he reflected, I would see no danger from the content of the thought itself. But then came an observation he could not ignore. Even so, thinking and pondering for too long would tire his body. And when the body grew tired, the mind became stressed. And when the mind was stressed, it could not settle into the deep stillness from which true insight arises. And so, the Buddha said, he stilled the inward thinking, settled it, unified it, brought the mind into deep collectedness, so that the mind would no longer be stressed. This shows where ordinary helpful thinking ends and where deeper meditation begins. Even the clearest, most wholesome thought must eventually be set down. Not because it was wrong, but because there is something quieter than thought into which the mind must finally rest. Right thought, in fact, is the second factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. If thinking itself were the enemy, the Buddha would not have placed a form of thinking on that path. What eats us alive is unawakened thinking, thinking done in the dark, without anyone watching. Thinking done in the light of awareness, directed wisely, ended when its work is done. That is what makes thinking a tool rather than a burden. So the practical art becomes a kind of inner discernment. When thinking is unwholesome noise, the anxious loop at 3 a.m, the long rehearsal of arguments you will never have, the replay of a pain you cannot change, simply observe. Sit on the bank. Let the leaves float past. When thinking is a necessary tool, solving a real problem, planning with care, considering how to speak honestly to someone you love, then think, but think with awareness. Know that you are thinking. Know what the thinking is for. Know when it is enough and set it down. And when the moment calls for action, act with wisdom, with kindness, with full presence. And so we return, at the end, to where we began, to the inner voice that will not stop. The mind was never going to be quiet on command, and that was never the point. The Buddha offered something far greater than a silent mind, a freedom that lives within the noise, a peace that does not require the noise to go away first. The river does not need to be stopped, the monkey does not need to be defeated, and there is no war to win against your own thinking. What is asked of you is something much smaller and much quieter. Simply to remember, as often as you can, one small and luminous truth. You are not the river. You are the one sitting on its bank, watching it flow. And when you remember this, even for a breath, even for a single honest moment, the storm begins to lose its hold. The storm has not been defeated. You have simply stopped mistaking it for yourself.